Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 30th of November 2014. Just getting ready for the outsiders.
And this morning's front pages divide between images of a tearful Michael Clarke and an ebullient Daniel Andrews. Who is Daniel Andrews? We'll come to that. The instant recognisability of the Australian cricket captain, however, is a clue to the national mourning that's rendered the continent sombre since the death of batsman Philip Hughes. Clarke has penned a heartfelt column for News Corp papers, farewelling
my mate, my brother.
And it joins the morning's other major pieces of cricket news, neatly summarised on the front of Sydney's Sun Herald.
Philip Hughes' funeral will take place in his hometown of Maxville on Wednesday. The Gabba test will be delayed to allow his grieving teammates to attend.
And a poignant, touching note.
On Saturday, young cricketers retired on 63, not out in tribute.
Though the last and quite poetic words should go to Michael Clarke.
One crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name.
And talk of an age without a name, it takes us naturally enough to the new Premier of Victoria, a man known variously before last night as Daniel Andrews, and, what's his name, that gawky bloke with the glasses. Not anymore, for Daniel's Labor has swept decisively, if somewhat anonymously, to power in Victoria. It might only have been a state election, but the change of government in Victoria is raising eyebrows more broadly, as Mark Kenny writes this morning at Fairfax Online.
There will be no shortage of theories about what caused the Victorian result, but you can safely bet federal Labor will target the toxic standing of the Abbott government as the key driver.
As it did last night with, Thingamy, the federal opposition leader, playing a prominent part in the Daniel celebrations. And federal repercussions will come, says Dennis Shanahan this morning at the Australian Online.
Inevitably, apart from the blame shifting, there will also be parallels drawn with the first-term coalition government in Victoria and Abbott's own first-term problems.
This morning's Sunday Herald Sun, with its beaming image of Daniel Andrews, or as the paper snappily dubs him,
damn the man.
It will be tough reading for Australian Conservatives. A new chapter is beginning in Victoria. As the Herald Sun reports,
Daniel Andrews has vowed to get straight to work on transforming Victoria after claiming a stunning election triumph last night.
That Liberal pain will be the deeper, argues Josh Gordon at the Sunday Age, because
Dennis Napthine should not have lost, not if history is any guide. The recriminations for the Liberal Party at both the state and national levels will be significant.
Dennis Napthine, for those still scrambling to catch up with this changing cast, was, until quite recently, the Victorian Premier. Not today.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Well, he may not be, but we are. And this morning, your outsiders are Dr. Gary Johns, who's a former minister, now director of the Australian Institute for Progress. Anne-Marie Tiernan joins you too, associate professor in the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University, co-author of The Gatekeepers, and Tim Burrows, content director at Mumbrella. Welcome to you all. Victorian politics is looming large in our consciousness, and here's a quote from someone who historically has had a fair bit to do with that.
The federal government, has that influenced the voters? Yes, I think it has in part, or maybe quite considerably. I mean, just introducing a new petrol tax 10 days out from an election is not what you'd call brotherly love from one Liberal government to another.
Former Victorian Premier Jeff Kennett speaking last week before the poll on 2GB in Sydney last night, speaking on a TV panel during the election count, he was quite forthright, referring to the federal government as a shambles. And it's been a tough week federally for the Liberal Party, for Tony Abbott's government, and last night's not going to do anything to lift that mood.
I think that's right, Jonathan. And the theme that keeps coming forward, isn't it, is the one of centralisation in the Prime Minister's office and the extent to which the government's agenda management and priorities are clear. And I think that's a similar criticism to the one that was levelled at the Baillieu and Napthine governments. So it'll be interesting to see what lessons the federal party might draw.
Well, and you know of which you speak in terms of those officers.
Oh, sure, but this is a problem
Tell us your pedigree.
Oh, okay. Well, I've just finished a book on that you mentioned in your intro, The Gatekeepers, and it looks at the evolving role of Prime Ministers, Chiefs of Staff. Now, why that's important is that increasingly Prime Ministers have taken to themselves some very significant responsibilities. There's been a lot of drivers of that. But centralisation and coordination is the big challenge as a leader, and so a lot rests on the organisational capacity of Prime Ministers and the people around them. And the same is true at the state level. Premiers, arguably that organisational capacity is even more important.
And Gary Johns, federally, there's much work to be done there. I mean, there was talk this week about barnacles and so forth, and those were taken initially to mean those very specific bits of post-budget hangover, things like the GP co-payment. But I wonder if that job of barnacle clearance is a bit broader than that, whether it should involve things like, for example, reshuffles.
Perhaps. But clearly the Abbott government is having trouble getting its agenda through the Senate. So the question is how it now approaches the Senate. In some ways it should line up double dissolution bills and put some pressure on a number of independent senators who should realise that they haven't got a job for free sitting there for 6 years knocking back government agendas. So either Abbott has to muscle up to them or walk away and create a new dialogue, if you like, and I'm not sure. Well, he'll have to think about that over Christmas.
Why does he lack the authority, though, on those things to muscle them through that Senate?
Well, it's not a matter of authority. I mean, you're dealing with, let's say, 6 independents who are brand new to the job and who only know that if they behave or often misbehave in particular ways, they get good coverage in the press and the media, which is not the media's fault. I'm just saying they are learning the ropes. They generally have no background whatsoever, not even an ideological presence, no sort of base from which to work. Someone gets in their ear and says, oh, you will be heard if you knock back these couple of dollars in this bill, and they say, oh, well, we couldn't have that, so they knock back the bill. So it'll take a while, I think, to have them settled in. I'd prefer that their minds were concentrated by the possibility of a double dissolution and having them out of a job fairly soon. That might help things along.
I mean, it's interesting, Tim Burrows, that talk of double dissolution became something of a talking point late in last week, as if there's some canvassing of, how do we go from here? What are the options? And I guess raising the rhetoric around that as a possibility is one of them.
And trying to, I guess, actually understand what the real problem or problems is. Is it, as you sort of suggest, policy? Is it the personnel? Are those the barnacles? Or is it the communication side of things? Or in fact, a little bit of all three? And I think that's one of the things is there's no one single thing to be fixed. There are a number of issues almost as the sort of government really takes its time transitioning from opposition to government. The habits formed in opposition, that kind of sort of political judo that you play when you're in opposition, where you turn the government of its day's actions against itself, doesn't necessarily work once you are that government. And I don't think they're quite playing karate instead yet. It's
interesting, isn't it, Anne-Marie Tin? And that, yes, I mean, and that's much discussed, the transition from opposition to government. But that barnacle point again, and this refers to that moment of transition, to the promises made in that campaign, to the reality then enacted in government. Whether the key barnacle is not the detail, but it is that issue around good faith.
Yeah, and I think too around the narrative. And I think it's important to sort of reflect on this. We always, get a bit presentist in the way that we think about these things, but this could be the same, a crystallising moment for the Abbott government in the way that the Travel Rorts affair in the aftermath was for Howard. I mean, people forget that the first 18 months of the Howard government were pretty rocky, and it's not uncommon for it to be very difficult to make that shift from campaigning to governing. And I think many of the incoming ministers in this administration, federally, did not understand the dependency and the need to negotiate and bargain. I think many of them came in '98 when things were very, had stabilised and arrangements had been put in place. The barnacles had been cleaned off, which is, I think, the sort of the genesis of that phrase that Arthur Sinodinos used to use working for Howard. And I think they had a majority in the Senate towards the end. So I think the habits of bargaining and negotiation don't come easily. And I think that, they've got a great opportunity to take a lesson out of that. And if they can do that, they can refocus in the way that Howard did successfully.
Your outsiders this morning are Anne-Marie Tin and Tim Burrows and Gary Johns. And Gary, you mentioned before that sort of bad senatorial behaviour, the intransigence or the ill discipline almost of various independent voices in the Senate. And that behaviour has been rewarded overnight with the government capitulating to the Jackie Lambie claim on defence conditions. Is that a good move?
Pretty much. Look, this is all about the price of getting your agenda through. So the price in Jackie's case will be some extra payment to the Defence Forces. There was always a price to pay to Tasmania for an independent Tasmanian senator. It seems as though they will forever be with us. That's right. So you say, okay, well, I want the following changes to whatever, a pension system through, a tax system through, and that means I have to save a forest here or build a hospital there or whatever in Tasmania. That's the nature of the federation, I suppose. And I think the Abbott government has to literally get into stride. Come on, it costs you a little bit of money to get something a bit bigger. And that's when you take your opposition, that is the Labor Green opposition, right out of it. And it just becomes the government and a couple of independents. And, they haven't got into stride yet.
That point, Tim Burrows, of getting into stride, I think is really interesting, and especially on this day after the Victorian campaign. And I suspect that the narrative explanation that will emerge from the Victorian campaign is that Ted Baillieu took 2 years to get into stride, and that the government, even though Dennis Napthine picked up the pace subsequently, the government suffered for that initial inertia. Now, the federal government, in a similar polling position to the way in which the Victorian Liberal government had been since its inception, behind consistently, suffering that same issue of initial inertia, the parallels start to become, fairly convincing.
Fairly convincing of, they feel very obvious at the moment. So much of politics is about momentum, and obviously the hardest bit of that is the getting moving in the first place, not so much the keeping moving. And that's what sort of makes me wonder, where are we going to see that? The stuff around GP co-payments, that feels like this is actually going to drag on because these attempts this week of sort of parking it haven't really worked. We don't
and
quite
great
know.
Confusion about those attempts as well, as we're reading in the papers again today too. The PM saying, well, we might not be doing that, and then getting the Treasurer out there next morning to say, oh, yes, we are.
And I think what it comes down to is absolutely, what makes the public feel cynical about the politics side of it is, I think most people realise who are following this, it's to do with, budget forecasts and not wanting to actually have to admit the bad news yet, but that's going to make the budget blow out even more if it doesn't happen. And it comes down to this kind of sort of feeling that there's cynical politics going on, which is something you see to a certain extent with any government, but I think the public would actually prefer to have a policy they don't like, people are honest about, rather than one where things are kind of fudged just for the to avoid the immediate headline.
Well, this is an interesting point, and Gary Johns, there was a piece written on the back of the result in Victoria by Andrew Bolt, and he saying the lesson from this is to get out and do something. Here you have a government in the Victoria shy of that, but you look at the Campbell Newman experience. There's somebody who definitely got out and did something and is reaping the reward for that in polling. Is that a factor? Is the sort of...
Okay, here endeth The Outsiders Part 1.